All right. Thank you very much. How's everyone doing? It's not a trick question. I'm very genuinely asking, like day 7, is it? How's everyone doing? What are energy levels like? Shall we do a bit of a stretching exercise before we actually get into some intellectual exercises? Yeah? I want you all to stand up. Okay. So a lot of my work that I'm presenting today is slightly old, but I think that is in the nature of scholarship, that we almost always present work which is done as opposed to work which we are doing. And a lot of my current work is actually around the question of pandemic technologies. Right? It is a multi-sited study which is happening in Hong Kong, New Delhi, New York, and Cape Town, trying to think about technological shifts that happened during the pandemic and how they produce us as subjectivities of different kinds. If you want to talk about that, you're not going to hear anything in the talk about it, but please catch hold of me anytime from now on till the end of the summer school because I'm here. So come and have a chat with me about it, okay? But one of the things that I learned during doing these workshops for the pandemic technologies was to think about, did everybody go on Zoom at some point to study and to learn and to pretend that you are actually trying to be normal human beings?
Yep.
Okay. Does anybody remember the one thing that you missed when you were on Zoom with other people? I want to see if you can come to my answer.
Feeling the room.
Feeling the room, that's right. Like you can no longer read human beings. Let's dig deeper into it. How do you feel the room?
Eye contact, body.
Anybody else? One thing that we missed on Zoom when we are talking to other people? Reaction times, because you are basically constantly looking only at yourself. All right, good. I'll tell you one of the most fascinating things that happened with technologization through Zoom. And you would never have realized it, but this is why, if I tell you now, you are immediately going to figure it out. Zoom uses AI filtering sound technologies, which filter out breathing. We all breathe when we talk. When I speak closer to the microphone, you will be able to hear like a breathing accent to my voice. All video conferencing softwares remove breathing as noise so that communication can be clearer. And so one of the things that I miss the most is actually the hearing of other people's breathing when I'm together. And once kind of we managed the pandemic a little bit better, I wanted to never take for granted the joy of breathing together. And that's what I want you to do today, this morning, before we get into conversations, right? I'm going to ask you to do something very simple. I want you to start just looking at where your body is, like think about where your head is. See how your neck is feeling. Are you like stressed out? Can you let it a little loose, let it drop? Find it in a different way, like move it to the left and the right, to the back and the front. All right? See where your shoulders are. How tense are you, right? This is where we hold most of our tension. And this is where we don't really know how to breathe. So figure out what is a comfortable position for your shoulders. Right. Put your hands on your waist and just feel where the tension is again. See if you can find like a comfortable stretch. Right. And anchor your feet. Right? Anchor your feet. See how you are standing. Like, are you standing straight or is it like a drill? Is this like, can you be more relaxed and find like the feet with your ground? Tap your foot a little bit. Like, see how it feels? Okay. And now I want you to close your eyes and we're just going to breathe together 3 times. Right? So I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3, deep breathe, breathe out. We don't do that 3 times. But while you are breathing, I want you to listen to the sound of other people breathing as well. All right? So let's close our eyes. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. And out. All right. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. And out. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. And out. All right. Slowly open your eyes at your own time. Look around the people that you are sharing that space with. And let's really hope that we hold on to this idea that we can breathe together without being really afraid of it in some way, right? The summer schools are very intense things. I know because I hosted two of them in the past. I was a grad student once who attended one of the first summer schools, and I know how intense it can be. And sometimes we are so kind of about the brain and the mind and deep ideas and aesthetics and so on that we forget that we also have bodies and we need to look after them. So this is just a brief reminder saying, think about what your bodies are doing, right? Like how comfortable they are, find spaces for you to be like breathing together and so on. All right, we can settle down and I can start talking about the work that I want to present to you. Thank you. It's okay. So, all right, I have multiple ways by which I wanted to present this work to you. The easiest one would be to do a lecture which talks to you about. I wrote a book because that's what academics do, we write books, and I can just tell you what's in the book. But I figured that that would be the least productive form of engagement with this group because the book is actually already there. And if my experience of teaching is anything to go by, no matter how much I tell you about the book, you're never going to read it anyway. I do have some wonderful YouTube videos of the book, so you can always have a look at that because, you know, then while you are cooking or playing with your pet or doing yoga or jogging, you can vaguely listen to what's knowledge. But what I thought was I would talk about how the book came into being. Right? Almost all of you are, in some way or the other, attempting to produce knowledge and largely produce it in a scholarly form, largely trying to think about either a PhD thesis or a master's report or a book if you are writing one. And I thought that it would be interesting to take you through the journey of what does it mean to write a book as a cultural studies scholar, right? And then the additional layer is that while I locate myself within cultural studies as a home discipline, I don't really do traditional culture studies. My work is very much about thinking through questions of digital technologies, emergent technologies, and the ways in which technopolitics kind of play out in different form. Because I am trained in humanities and cultural studies, but I also have training as a computer scientist, which means that I also am used to building technologies, even as I critically kind of analyze it. But I don't necessarily want to think about, I don't want you all to turn into programmers. Except that I do really think that it's a basic literacy that's needed, and you should all know how to program. Even if you know how to program very badly, that's okay, but you should know that programming is a language that you should know, but that's a different conversation, right? But I do want to talk about, while I'm thinking through how the book comes into being, I also want to talk about how do you, as a younger cultural studies scholar, or you might not be located in a cultural studies department, but you're trying to do more interdisciplinary humanities or social sciences work, how do we engage with technology? Like, is there anybody in the room who does like or hardwares or networking or any such thing? No? Has anybody ever built a website? You have, which means that you are like semi-programmers, and with generative AI, you don't really need to do much programming, right? You can just ask it to produce a code and you can make a website, right? But there is a certain tendency among social sciences and humanities where we keep on thinking that we have nothing to do with digital technologies because we don't build digital technologies, right? We have a fluency with books. Like we all love doing print and literature because we think that we can write. A lot of us do visual analysis because we think that even though most of us haven't really produced cinema, we all certainly have a visual aesthetics and a fluency with cinema. And if push comes to shove, you could be forced to make a movie, right? I mean, it could be a very bad movie, but let's face it, almost all cinema is bad movies anyway, right? Which is true. Like, and I say it with great love because I have like a profound joy for B-grade science fiction movies. Like, if you ask me the one genre that I want to watch, that's all I want to watch. Like, really bad science fiction is the best science fiction in the world, right? Um, but when it comes to the digital technologies, we kind of start withdrawing ourselves, saying, "Oh, that's not my domain." Despite that, when I first wanted to make this circle, I actually wanted to take away the demons
And then I realized I can't do that because all of you cannot see without
laptops, right? Like
everybody needs a digital device on the platform in order to
engage with what
happening. Like this has become your comfort. And I understand it. I mean, I need tools just to keep enough distance from others. Like this is my safe, my laptop from the rest. And that's so I want us
to think through what our
when it's
as scholars in humanities and social sciences and in cultural studies of thinking through the digital, not necessarily as a technological form, but as a socio-cultural form, right? And how we still can keep on engaging with the politics and the sociality and the dimensions of digital technologies. And I thought that the book would be a good idea to do it. Now, having said that, this is the book. If you want to download a book, another book that you're not going to read, you can scan the QR code and download it and feel very happy about the fact that you downloaded a book. It's open access, which is always fun. And I don't mean it as a complaint either. I don't know if people are familiar with this Latin American fiction writer called Borges, right? And Borges had this wonderful idea where he says that you collect books not because you want to read them, but because you want to be surrounded by them, right? If you think about books as food in a pantry or as medicines in a medicine closet, you don't keep food in the pantry because you're going to eat all of it at the same time. But you know that at 2 a.m., one day you will wake up and all you crave for is ramen. And then you can have as much like potatoes in your pantry, but if you don't have ramen, you're going to be sad, right? And so you keep ramen in your pantry because one Thursday night at 2 a.m. you want to eat ramen. That's how you collect books. Because you might not read it right now, but one day you will wake up and saying, oh, damn, I wanted to think about information overload and pornography. And that's when you want the book there, right? Like so that you can be comforted by it. So it's a good idea to always kind of collect books even if we don't end up reading all of them. All right. So I'll talk about the book, and I'm going to talk about it in a different way. I'm going to talk about 5 reasons why I think the book exists, and it's in collaboration as an inter-Asia network. It's actually 3 generations of scholars who wrote it together. Ashish Rajadhyaksha, who was on my PhD committee, and Nafis Aziz Hassan, and I was his external examiner for his PhD. So it's also kind of a nice thinking through 20 years of conversations, specifically within the South Asian and the Indian context, thinking about the internet. So I'm going to present my version of the book. That doesn't mean that this is the version of the book. I'm almost certain that Ashish and Nafis will have very different stories of why the book comes into being, but this is my interpretation of it, right? So I'm going to talk about 5 reasons why this book came about, 4 concepts that I want to introduce to you as socio-cultural ways of unpacking digital technologies, 3 arguments that I think we as scholars who are particularly interested in the inter-Asia cultural studies intellectual project should be dealing with, right? And 2 frameworks which I hope will be useful for you, because even though you might not be scholars of the digital, I'm almost certain that digital is a part of your scholarship. It's inevitable. You go into the remotest village in Asia and do ethnography, and one of the things that's going to come up is that they use smartphones, right? And that there is a way by which the digital kind of mediates and shapes their life and informationality. So I'm going to give you 2 frameworks which hopefully are helpful, and then one final hypothesis. So this is like my extended TED talk. Like if there is only one thing you need to remember after I've spoken at you for 1 hour, this is the one thing I hope you will take away, right? So that's the structure of the book and of the talk. And I'm going to try and not like just bombard information at you, but they did the mistake of giving me 2 hours, and I have to fill it up. So there is a lot of information that's going to come to you, but all of the information is going to be mediated by memes, because memes make everything easier, all right? And so much of the book is also not just about what is in the book, but also how book projects actually come into being, especially if they are long durational intellectual projects, especially if they are collaborative projects, and how do we work with them. Okay, so why did this book come about? Let's begin with the first specific thing. So in 2006, people who are familiar with South Asian politics will already know this poster or at least what's on it. The government of India set up something called the UIDAI, which was the Unique Identifier Authority of India, which was the world's largest biometric database building exercise. Right? The word for it is called, the project is called Aadhaar. That's the name on it. This is where the Adarsh Balak, Aadhaar Balak. Adarsh is ideal. So these are posters which I used to grow up with as a kid about what a good child does in India. And then once India started like developing a biometric identity project, there were these newly furbished what a digital child does in an idealized form, right? So this is a poster kind of which comes out as one of those series. But India started the world's largest biometric digital citizenship record project. And while that is commendable, it comes with a series of problems. So for example, we were going to build the largest biometric database without having a comprehensive data privacy and protection law in the country, which means that we were all going to surveil and extract biometric data, right? And biometric data is inalienable data. Your name, your identity, your religion, your gender, they can all be legally changed. You can't change your fingerprint. You can't change your iris. You can't change your DNA samples. So we were thinking of, this was the first major shift where we were moving from informational sense of privacy to a data sense of privacy. Yeah? And informational privacy we know how to deal with. We know how to protect our information. We know how to not give out information if we don't want to. We know how to retract information. We know how to deal with censored information. We know how to deal with information that is used against us. And legally, in terms of policy and regulation, we have a very strong tradition of dealing with informational subjects. We don't have that much experience of figuring out what happens to data when data becomes the fundamental way of defining subjectivity, right? And so we started looking at the Aadhaar project not merely as a database building exercise, but a data subject building exercise. That for the first time, to the state of law, you as a citizen were no longer able to go and say, my name is Nishant, this is where I was born, this is how old I am, this is my caste, this is my religion, this is my education, which are all informational stories about me. I could actually go into an Aadhaar project and say nothing about me, but just give my thumbprint, and that thumbprint stands in for me as a kind of a data subject. That is a radically different way of thinking about mediating relationships between citizens and states. Because we thought that the relationship we have with our states is built with stories, right? So it's informational, it's narrative. And here was the first project which was trying to basically say, no, the relationship between a state and the subject is about data. And we had no regulation or no policy to think through data privacy, data security, data safety, data subjectivity, data ownership, and so on and so forth. So the Aadhaar project, which started in 2008, so this is how old the book is. Like it got published in 2022, but the book started forming in 2008, when we were doing live ethnographies of Aadhaar as it was kind of piloting across India, looking at a variety of sectors from health to financial inclusion, to digital safety, to conditions of citizenship, and so on and so forth, right? So that's one kind of, let's say, milestone which informs the book in a certain way. The second reason why the book should have existed and should exist is because India now holds the record of the longest internet shutdown in history, right? For 552 days, the entire territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the northern state of India, which is like contested territory between India and Pakistan, for 552 days, the people in the valley were without the internet, right? I don't know if you understand what 552 days without the internet is like. It's almost 2 entire years with no Instagram, right? I mean, forget news, forget Google, no Instagram. I don't know what you do. Like if you don't have Instagram, how do you eat? Because what do you take pictures of and who do you share it with? Like you can't keep on inviting your neighbors and saying, look at my bowl of cereal. Right? That's not going to happen. So funny as it seems, the internet shutdown also was a significantly new phenomenon. And I think for a lot of us who come from different Asian countries, we have experienced the internet shutdown as a form of population control, right? And again, internet shutdown is a radically difficult thing to understand from our traditional humanities and cultural studies perspectives, because if I asked you to give me examples of how you deal with censorship, you all will have some idea of how to do it, right? There is legal recourse in countries which have a more functioning democracy, where you can challenge the state and saying no, censorship is not allowed because freedom of speech and expression are needed. In countries which have a different or more, let's say, conservative information regime, censorship still has possibilities of circumventing, right? Okay, I can't say this, but I can say this, which almost means this, and hence I can say what I want to, right? Internet shutdown is a new ball game because it's not censorship at the level of information, it's censorship at the level of infrastructure. I will allow you to say whatever you want to say, but I will take away the microphone. Now you can keep on saying what you want to say, but nobody's going to hear you, right? This capacity of actually using infrastructural regulation to censor voice and expression is radically new, right? In India, it was only in 2020 that the Supreme Court of India finally agreed that internet shutdowns are a violation of fundamental human rights, because an internet shutdown is not just about you putting up a picture on Instagram, but it now no longer allows you to communicate with people that you know or you don't. It infringes on your rights to publicly gather into different places. It cuts you off from information. It doesn't allow you rights to self-determination as well as rights to political exercise in terms of economic activities, right? Or social movement building or protest or any of that kind. The book talks about the case. It's the case which is, I mean, if you want the case title, it's Anuradha Bhasin versus the Union of India 2020. And so this was another reason why we wanted to talk about the internet, so to speak, in India, but also more from a cultural politics of the internet. All right. The third thing that was happening within this particular space was the question of free basics. How many people have heard of net neutrality? Net neutrality, is that something that's familiar to you? No? All right. So net neutrality is a basic technological standard which says that right now, if I was downloading cartoons of Hello Kitty and you were downloading, hopefully, my book, the internet would not discriminate about the bandwidth that is allocated, so that a Hello Kitty cartoon and a book written by a scholar would get exactly the same amount of bandwidth to be downloaded. Right? This is the fundamental architecture of how the World Wide Web operates. Because we do not discriminate at the basis of content. Right? They call it content agnostic. So no matter what you are downloading, it can be really, really shitty pornography, it can be bad science fiction movies, it can be Hello Kitty memes, and it can be the entire Library of Congress. The internet as a network does not discriminate based on the content about who will get better bandwidth, which is why we keep on often thinking about the internet as a democratic space, not because it's without power, but because at an architectural level, the internet allows for no discrimination at the level of content. Now, can you imagine who would be very upset with this kind of principles? Who would not like this? That everybody accesses the information and no matter what the information is, they get the same amount of bandwidth. Universities, you have a very bleak view of the university. Okay. It's true. So governments is another example. But actually one of the, And it's interesting, and we can come back to this in question and answers about why you think it's governments and universities. I can see the point. But you have to remember that the internet as we know it, which is largely the World Wide Web, is almost a market entity, right? And the people who do not like net neutrality are the companies which are trying to profit from the internet. Facebook was pissed that it is spending so much money in developing the world's global infrastructure of the internet, and then not-for-profit organizations like Wikipedia, who don't do anything to develop the world's infrastructure, get the same amount of bandwidth as Facebook, right? So Facebook, in collaboration with Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Samsung, formed a not-for-profit called Free Basics. Free Basics was an NGO or a not-for-profit organization that went to governments in the developing worlds, which included almost all of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And they went to them and they said, we will build universal access for your countries. We'll give free internet to 1.4 billion people in India. Except that the internet will be decided now based on what we think is the internet. So we will give you free access, but there will be a list of 50 websites, and those 50 websites will be free. Everything else has to be paid content. Yeah. In order to materially do this, the Indian government would have to step out of the net neutrality agreements. Because what you are essentially saying is that I'm building a information superhighway, and only those websites which I believe are good can travel on that information superhighway. And so the next 1 billion people who are coming online will think that the internet is made up of 50 websites because that's all they will have access to. And everything else is paid. And so we're not censoring anything, but we're just creating a differentiality in it. By the time Facebook and Free Basics came to India, these were the kind of posters that they were making, right? Like these are actually responses to the posters that they had. They were all about, oh, we are going to make India inclusive, oh, we are going to give access to people who are in rural India, to the farmers, to the illiterate people, to the poor people, and so on. And they were forcing India to step out of the net neutrality agreements. And this was not new, because before this, they had already succeeded in convincing 38 other governments across the world to step out of the net neutrality agreements, including the USA, right? So before India steps out of net neutrality, they also do lobbying in the US so that the US became the first developed country, so to speak, which stepped out of the net neutrality agreements as well. Something strange happened in India. Facebook lost. India became the first country which actually won against the combined efforts of these 7 big corporations. And the Supreme Court of India finally heard a case and gave out a ruling which said that access to internet is a fundamental human right enshrined in our constitutional articles, right? It said that access to knowledge is such a fundamental right for the future of the country that any attempt at infringing on that particular space is impossible. And so this became the first time when somebody pushed back against it. And we had the largest public consultations, which means that at some point, 100 million people called the Department of Telecommunications to tell them that they want net neutrality. And they want this right to exist in India because universal access cannot be achieved as a compromise of net neutrality. The two have to go hand in hand, right? I'm laying out the framework for you just to show you perhaps the possibility of what cultural studies research can look like, to just show you what are the different kinds of documents we are reading, right? From legal policies and regulations, to popular frameworks and campaigns, to the different kinds of scholarship and literature around censorship and blackout. So the capacity to kind of bring all of these things together to read something as silly and stupid as the internet is perhaps one of the most exciting things of my work. All right. The fourth thing that was the reason why this book, I think, came into being is because from 2017 onwards, India has been experiencing something called WhatsApp lynch mobs. These are largely misinformation lynch mobs, which means that based on xenophobia, Islamophobia, different forms of caste politics and different forms of largely kind of hatred-filled community organization. There are WhatsApp groups which keep on spreading fake information about a stranger who's like a Muslim who's kidnapping children, or somebody who, because they have a butcher shop, are selling beef, and because cow is a holy animal, we should go and kill the people to save the cow, right? There have been, in 2017 when it started, there were 27 recorded cases of WhatsApp lynch mobs. It has only exponentially grown. The last record in 2023 had 238 deaths of crowds coming together and literally killing people with their bare hands based on misinformation and rumor, right? This capacity to organize new forms of collectives, but also translating from the virtual to the physical, suddenly brought new scrutiny to being digital. And what do we do with this leaky and creepy nature of digital technologies as they become new forms of organizing principles, right? So the book was very informed by the idea that we know a lot about online activism now. Like, I'm sure everybody once at some point tweeted Me Too and made your Facebook profiles with black squares because, you know, Black Lives Matter. And you did all your performative politics online. And we are used to understanding how these things happen. What we haven't quite gotten used to is what happens when online collectives translate into physical activities on the ground. Right? What happens when online forms of collectivity, like a lynch mob, which is a WhatsApp group, suddenly becomes a physical mob? Right? How does a collective form, either a mob or a set of protests, is something that we haven't quite grappled with, and that's something that the book kind of looks at. And then the last thing, because you know nothing sells like pornography, is that the book is informed by the fact that everybody in India has been desperately just trying to watch pornography, and the government keeps on banning it. This is not new. From 2006 onwards, the Indian state has decided that we should not watch porn. Because apparently if you watch porn, I don't know what happens. Something must happen to them. But what was, of course, then incredibly funny is that ever since the Indian government, especially the right-wing government, has tried to censor pornography in the country, every year we get a news case about members of the parliament actually watching porn while sitting in the parliament. And they forget that like there is this television cameras which are watching them. So we have like ministers watching porn on their iPads, ministers watching porn on their cell phones, ministers sexting with underage people and asking them for their boob pictures or sending them their dick pics while a regulation is going on so on and so forth. So we did want to kind of think about what is the anxiety about pornography, right? For a country where if you have never known anything about India, I think the three things you will know about us is that we eat curry, we have the Taj Mahal, and we wrote the Kama Sutra. Like literally, like that's like the Western stereotype of what India is. I mean, you might also think that I'm the king of somewhere, but I think that's where it would stop. I'm not even joking. My last name literally means king. So it's like, it's not a very far-fetched hypothesis. Okay. But we were very interested in thinking about what exactly is being managed by generating an anxiety around pornography, right? What are the different kinds of social and political configurations that are happening in thinking through this anxiety about an entire population watching pornography? I mean, we're literally talking about the country with the highest birth rate and the largest global population in the world now. So it's not like people are watching porn and hence producing babies. I mean, we're doing it no matter what, right? So what exactly is the anxiety around porn? And at the same time, while pornography was being censored, there were no regulations for protection of women against non-consensual sharing of pornographic images. So on the one hand, there was this law which kept on censoring pornography. And on the other hand, the same law seemed to be incapable of dealing with women whose images and pictures were being recorded without their consent, through spy cameras, through people who took intimate pictures of them, through bizarre genres like under the skirt cameras with selfie sticks held at concerts and so on, which led to then doxing and exposing of the women and using pornography or pornographic images as a way of shaming and controlling women and their access to public. We were also tracking, for example, that primarily it was women who held public office who were the most threatened by these kinds of things. And you can already see how dated the book is because we don't even talk about deep fakes. Because between the time the book was written and the book was published, the entire conversation about pornography has actually moved to AI generated pornography, and that's going to open up a whole new kettle of fish. Okay, but this is just me laying out the 5 concepts or 5 reasons why I think the book exists, right? The 3 chapters in the book, which are very long chapters, deal with these questions. And if you are interested in any one of them, you can pick up the book and you can just look at that one section and read what's more in it to see if that's helpful to you. Okay. So this is how the basic context or the literature mapping of the book is. And from there on, we start thinking about these 3 conditions that we think we want to present to you, right? That when we think about the internet, we need to think of 3 things. We need to think about information overload, we need to think about information creep, and we need to think about information excess. So those 5 things that I kind of mapped out for you, the book analyzes using these 3 conceptual frameworks and trying to see how it makes sense to it. The idea that it begins with the question of the digital subject is something that Nafis Hassan writes about in his particular section. So the digital subject, or the idea of the digital subject being produced, is a fascinating one. And in my own writing in the book, I say that it is the making of a user, right? But it's not user with a U, but it's a user with a Y-O-U. That we are not just users in terms of we are using the internet, but we are users because we are literally being used by the internet. The user of the internet is I and you, and the conversations that we have between us. The capacities of the state and the corporation to access you, and the ways in which you are then installed onto this new operating governance system, which we call the digital state, is something to think through. Now, it's a possibility that almost all of you have dealt with the idea of the digital state, but when it comes to the digital user, we only think about the user as somebody who uses technologies, as opposed to the user as somebody who's produced by the technologies that they are using, as well as the technologies that they are being used by, right? And how do you kind of deal with this idea that the technologies that we use for emancipation, self-determination, dating, love, and expression are also technologies which are similarly extracting data from us, putting us into conditions of surveillance, and creating a new digital footprint for us, which we will need social, political, and cultural theories for, right? So the idea of the user kind of deals with this particular question. It talks, for example, in my essay about this particular instance where there are new regulations that the Indian government has passed, and I know that there are similarities in the city that I live in right now, in Hong Kong, but also what's happening in the US and other parts of the world, is that you are all potentially terrorists, right? I have no idea if you know how digital infrastructures really work, but are all of you connected to the university Wi-Fi in some form or the other right now? Yeah? Did you know that if right now I or my laptop is downloading information on how to make a bomb and how to blow up a university, all your laptops are already being targeted by that same information, and you are potentially now terrorists unless you prove otherwise. And this has nothing to do with information, but it has everything to do with how digital local area networks work, right? And the book kind of explains it, but I can also try it very simply. So let's say if I had to send this microphone to Andy who's sitting over there, what would be the easiest and the most direct way of doing it? It would be for me to stand up and give to Andy, or to throw it at Andy and he will catch it, right? If I had 30 microphones to give out, then it would mean that I would give the first microphone to Andy, and then I will go each time to bring a microphone and then send it out to other people. And while I'm giving it to one person, 29 other people are waiting to receive the microphone. That what I'm describing you to is basically the fundamental problem of digital networks. Like 100 people at the same time are asking for the same information, And if you send information only one by one, that's a dead cause because the server would get overloaded and it would not, everything would slow down and nobody would get proper internet. So what the internet architecture does is actually it breaks up this mic into multiple bits, right? So we know of bits and bytes, which are basic units of information transfer within digital systems. Physical property does not happen that way. If I break up this mic and I spread it across, we'll have to reassemble it. With digital information, it's very simple. I can actually break up, if there are 30 people who are asking for a file, I can break up the file into 30 pieces. I can send it to all the 30 people only one piece of information, and then I can ask all their computers to take other 29 pieces from other 29 computers, stitch it together, and it becomes a complete digital object. Right? Now, what I'm describing is a voluntary server mechanism where you asked for this information and hence the information is passing through your systems. But the internet also works on something called redundant computation. Most of your time, you are not using the full computational powers of your computers. Most of the times, you're using like 30 or 40% of it. An intelligent network says, okay, for 60% of the time, if your random access memory is free, if Nishant is downloading this file, which is very large, I'm going to cut that file into 60 pieces, and I'm going to put temporarily some pieces of that information on your laptop so that you never choke up the information system, and I will cat it. Which means that anytime there is redundant architecture or redundant computational time on your machine, if I am downloading objectionable material, there is a possibility that that material is passing through your laptops and leaving a digital trace, which means that at some point, without you knowing, you are a terrorist, a pornographer, and a pirate. And the government will get you, right? So the book kind of thinks through how you produce these kinds of digital subjects and looking at it. The second argument or the conceptual framework is around the question of access, which is where Nafis Hassan's work is. And Nafis is possibly one of the finest historians of technologized bureaucracy that I know of, which basically means, I don't know how many of you do archival work, but I'm certain that your idea of an archive includes a computer in an air-conditioned library where you sit and you order a search query and then somebody tells you, this is what most archives actually look like, right? No indexing, no metadata, just file after file of like material which is decaying and rotting. And Nafis goes into these archives largely to look at a prehistory of the internet. He's essentially trying to figure out how did bureaucratization of the Indian state go hand in hand with the development of internet governance technologies, right? And it's a very interesting idea because he goes on to say that almost all of us, in order to become new forms of citizen subjects, have become data operators for our governments, right? If this is the state of your government's archive, how do you think your government is managing your digital ID cards, your smart cards, your financial gateway models, and so on and so forth? Does anybody have an idea about who is producing the data for the government services to operate? Yes, you have no idea, but basically the government doesn't produce any information about you. You and I are endlessly producing and cleaning and verifying and sorting and storing data for our governments to control us, right? It's an incredible relationship between the state and the subject where you are essentially the free data producers, data storers, and the data gatherers for your government and for other corporations who are also looking at it. In his section, Nafis basically looks at the bureaucratization of data production and the ways in which data is being produced to manage citizens. And he proposes the idea that in this role as unpaid data workers, we have all become evacuated citizenships. Because I again don't know what the digital infrastructure in each of your countries is. By nationality, I'm Dutch, so the only government that actually owns me completely is the Dutch government, right? It's in the Netherlands. In order to talk to the Dutch government, I need 11 steps of digitization before I can even talk to the government in any form. Yeah? 11 steps, and all of it requires producing digital assets and digital credentials of different kinds, without which the government can acknowledge me but cannot talk to me. So almost all the work I do for the government is actually merely data production, because by the time I have reached a step where I can talk to the government, I'm just tired. Because all I have done is like free data production, data management, verification, and so on. And at the end of it, I'm going to meet a system which actually no longer wants to talk to me anyway. Right? So it talks about the excess of data and the ways in which data subjects are formed, but also how they are producing new forms of citizenship and subjectivity that you want to think through. And the third chapter in the book, or the concept, which is also kind of thinking about data as creep. And we mean creep in the creepiest form of the word. I want you to think about the most uncomfortable physical situation that you have been in, where you were just sitting at a family dinner and somebody just touched you in a way that you did not like, or you were in a concert and you felt a finger running through your back, or you were hugged by an uncle who just holds you for the extra 3 seconds, which makes you squirm, or you sat in front of a colleague who looked at you and then really looked at you so that you just really wanted to go and take a shower, right? I want you to think about the creep and the disgust of unwanted touch and realize that we are living with data creep. Data touches us in unwanted, non-consensual forms, and it envelopes us into conditions of absolute creepiness in interesting ways. You want to think about the idea that every second that we are doing digital transactions, we are leaking data, and that that data is creepily being collected by things that you cannot see, right? There is information that is constantly bleeding, and it is producing a new form of surveillance mechanism which we don't even have the capacity to articulate right now. Is everybody a Harry Potter fan? Or has everybody at least read a Harry Potter book or seen a Harry Potter movie? I mean, I have very problematic politics with J.K. Rowling's idiocy right now, so we're going to ignore that. But at least in the Chamber of Secrets, when Ginny Weasley is writing her secrets to the diary, right, and Voldemort kind of comes back to life, Mr. Weasley tells her, saying, "Haven't I taught you never to trust something unless you can see where its brain is?" Right? Where its brain is. That's the line. He says, I thought I had taught you not to trust something unless you can see where its brain is. I think we need the same lesson for all our digital devices. Do you know where your computer's brain is? Do you know where your data is going to be stored? Do you know who is accessing it, who is using it, and who is manipulating it in different forms? And I will tell you right now that you don't. As Wendy Chun, who's probably one of the finest new media scholars alive, reminds us that the more our devices are transparent, the more they become opaque. The more you think that you can just see the information that is in front of you, the more you are losing the data which is behind, which is completely out of your control, and it is at a speed and a scale that needs to be kind of theorized all over again, right? And so these are like the different forms of digital subjectivity that we are looking at. This is like a Bollywood meme which makes sense to you only again if you watch B-grade Bollywood films like I do. I'm not even going to try and decode it, but I find it hilariously funny. So all of it brings down us to this idea of one thing, right? Saying, how do we read the internet? And I want to quickly wrap up by giving you 2 frameworks of reading the internet then. Because I've laid out for you different sources that we are dealing with, different ways in which we are interpreting it, different methods which come into understanding the political formations of digital subjectivity. And then we have to be like, oh, now we have to read the internet. How do you do it? And this is where we all become lazy. And if we are from literature studies, we go and read the internet like it's a book. If we are from cinema studies, we go and read the internet as if it's a movie. If we are from cultural studies, we often go and read the internet as if it's a cultural form or an artifact. And in none of it we talk about the materiality and the architecture and the history of computation and the ways in which the network actually operates the internet, right? So one of the challenges of this book was that we didn't want to write a book for computers programmers. We didn't want to write a book which was merely about showing what the architecture of the internet is and what is wrong with it, but we wanted to understand the logic of the internet as a cultural and a political practice. And then how do you translate that logic to form critical interventions and help make interventions, especially at the level of policy, law, regulation, and governance, which are things which we often kind of discount in our analysis. So that was one of the first things that we wanted to kind of bring out, saying, if you want to read the book, don't read it for the content. You might dismiss the book saying, oh, it's all about India. I don't really work on India. Don't even read it for India. Read the book as a methodological exercise in how do you read this thing called the internet, right? Look at the different kinds of sources which go into the making and the understanding of this technological form that we've taken for granted. And our second framework, and this is going to be something that is going to be thrown at you over and over again, is that you need to start refusing area studies as a way of identifying your scholarship. Unless you are heavily invested in area studies, which is a discipline which has its own colonial legacies, because area studies always said that there are some parts of the world which are global areas, and then there are some parts of the world which are ethnic areas. And no matter what your scholarship is going to be, if you don't talk about the US and Europe, you are basically an area studies scholar, right? I mean, I know there are substantial ways in which like post-colonial reforms have happened of the discipline. So now there is also American studies, which is an area studies discipline and so on. But then what is fun is that American studies gets to be the only discipline that studies America through an American framework, just like it reads Asia, Africa, and Latin America through an American framework, right? So there has to be a way by which we start thinking about, at different points, all of you who are completing your PhDs especially, you are going to be forced into thinking, oh, so your work is about Malaysia, or your work is about Indonesia, or you are a Singaporean scholar, or you are an Indian scholar. And this book was an attempt to saying, no, I am a scholar of the internet. I just happen to write about the internet in India, right? Do not box yourself down into one specific kind of geography or an area, because that is always going to do you a disservice. That's always going to mean that your scholarship is relevant only to the people in the geography that you are writing to. And so only people who are doing Indian studies or South Asian studies or Malaysian studies or Singaporean studies should read you and cite you. But our global canon is always going to be a Euro-American writer who writes about a small village in Germany and how people in Germany in that small village used to deal with falling of trees and production of wood. Does this ring a bell? Do you know who I'm talking about? No? It's Karl Marx, right? Marx's first essay was about the Black Forest, a small region in Bavaria, and how people in that small, tiny provincial village in Germany, where their relationship with timber and wood and production and so on and so forth, and that's global theory. But Partha Chatterjee, who writes about what happens to 1.4 billion people in India in his book Politics of the Governed, gets dismissed as somebody who is an Indian political scientist who you need to read only if you are reading Indian theory, right? So I would basically ask you to use this book also as perhaps an example where we had to fight with every publisher who wanted to publish us as an South Asian studies book or a post-colonial studies book or a global South book, and basically refused to have the word India in our title. So we fought against it and saying, no, our book is called Overload, Creep, Excess. And then we anchor it and saying it's about an internet from India, but it's not an Indian internet, right? Despite the fact that everything that we write about is actually only from the Indian context. But you know what? Every single American friend I have writes only about a small part of the US, and if their work can count as global scholarship, so can ours. So it's not just about thinking through the Inter-Asia mission of making Asia intelligible to each other. But I think this is also a positionality that you can take in saying my scholarship has global dimensions. I'm not just a native informant who's telling you what happens in my country because you are too lazy to pay attention to it, but what I'm producing has global ramifications. And we need to keep on remembering and reminding ourselves that we actually occupy the majority worlds in this globe. The work that you do affects way more people than almost all of Europe put together, right? So if your scholarship is about mainland China, for example, and if you are collaborating with somebody who is writing from India, between the two of you, you are talking about things that are happening to 1/3 of the global population. This cannot be a minority discourse. This cannot be an area studies. This is the majority discourse. And even if you are writing from smaller countries or smaller geographies, the ways in which our networks are connected, right, and the ways in which we can reimagine the world with our region as the center is an intellectual challenge that I'm asking you to kind of take through for the next step. And then, the last thing I wanted to kind of think through, and this is, as I said, you will forget everything that I have said, but if you do, then this is still the one thing I hope you will take away from my talk as well as reading the book, is that we need to stop talking about the internet as a new technology. It's not. Just because your older professors or intellectual scholars do not have the capacity to deal with it does not make it new. It just means that they don't have the capacity to deal with it. The internet is a historical artifact. In fact, the first conversations around the internet start in the 1930s. The first frameworks of what is software and hardware and computation goes all the way back to the 1918s, when people were having conversations about automation and what machines can do. There is a certain breathlessness when we come to talk about the digital, as if it's always new and it's always changing, and so we can't study it. And if we can study it, all we can do is describe what is happening in it. But if you slow down and realize that in Asia, the first Ministry of Information and Communication Technologies for Development and Digital Communication started in 1980s, you realize that the internet is so old that it's actually last century. Right? There are students in my class who were not even born during that period. And nor was I, just in case you have questions about my age. But the idea is that it's necessary to slow down our conversations about the internet and recognize that a lot of the things that we are experiencing now, as well as lots of the things which are going to manifest in the future, are already results of decisions which were made in the past. And that if you are planning to study the internet or digital cultures in any meaningful way, it would be fantastic to go back to the history of the technologies in your country, to think about what were the different decisions that were taken at the level of the market, the state, the government, regulation, usage, penetration, flows of commodities, different forms of cultural expressions and products, and see how you can historicize the internet. And for all of you who are more or less going to come into the job market in the age of generative AI, this is going to be even more critically necessary. Because in 3 years, if you are going to do your job talk, and if you're talking about the digital in any form, there's somebody in the audience going to stand up and saying, but this is irrelevant because we don't use the internet anymore, we only use generative AI. And it's going to be your job to tell them that generative AI is a very, very old technology. It's a historically determined, and it has been made beyond just the technological innovations which are happening within the space. So I think the one thing I wanted all of you to take with you is to remember that the internet is a historical artifact, and that it's going to be your job to both historicize, politicize, and bring that history back into the conversations about the internet that are happening now. So if you want to talk about pornography, terrorism, biometric databases, and so on and so forth, it doesn't have to begin in the now. There is a longer history, but the work hasn't been done of excavating that history, and that we need to build it together. All right. So as a last stop, because I position myself in academia, but I also work a lot with civil society actors who try and make shifts in policy. This is the one line that we always use, that the interventions for the future are in the past. You cannot wait for internet and digital technologies to have problems in the future, which we are also going to solve once the problems happen in the future. That a lot of the problems we are experiencing now and we see in the making have already been pre-decided and designed in the past. And I think we are at a good time in cultural studies and social sciences and humanities to start historicizing digital technologies and start looking at when what decisions were made so that the future is being shaped in a certain way.